Boa tarde, pessoal.
Good afternoon, everyone who's watching us. We are back here for our last session of our first day of the symposium. So we're here for the special lecture 1 of the second International Symposium on Toponymy. And this is for special lectures of Professor Márcia Maria Duarte dos Santos and Professor Jorn Seaman. And Professor Márcia Maria Duarte is a doctor in geography with emphasis in space organization by the State Paulista Universidade Júlia Mesquita, Unesp. In 1999, she's a retired professor of the Department of Geography of the Geosciences Institute of the Federal University of Minas Gerais. She's currently as a volunteer in UFMG as a coordinator for educational activities of the Reference Center for Historical Cartography in the National Museum of UFMG. She's experienced in geography with emphasis on historical cartography, acting especially on the following themes: historical geography of Minas Gerais and cartography, and also Portuguese cartography, and cartographic education and education in museums. Professor Jordan Seaman is an assistant professor researching the maps of the society, and in particular, the experiences with mental maps, cartographic education, and creative ways of thinking and representing the space and the place. And its focus is Latin America with emphasis on Brazil. She had a master's by the Hamburg University in Germany in 1995 and doctorate by the Louisiana State University. So we will begin the presentations with the first lecturer, Professor Márcia Maria Duarte. And we would like to remind you that comments and questions from the audience can be made on the chat of the Zoom or on YouTube and also at the platform of the event. So thank you very much. And Professor Márcia, you have the floor. Thank you, Tainá. I'd like to greet you and salute you for being here together, and greeting everyone, all of the organizers, the members of the scientific team of the symposium, the participants. It's a great pleasure to be able to participate and to have the opportunity. This is also an honor to update the state of the art on toponymy by hearing the Brazilian researchers and also researchers from other countries who are here. So I would like to begin by talking about a theme that I believe is of my interest. I could not open here on the first page, sorry, on the first slide, but I would like to make a reflection about the connections that are pertinent between toponymy, topophilia, memory, and identity. And so for that, I will remember, well, it's very important to remember because everybody knows that. Everybody knows and has this internalized. Nowadays, Professor Jordan showed us a very beautiful image of a tapestry. And what I'm going to say now verbally is what he meant. The creation of names to identify, individualize, or singularize places is an immemorial human practice. And so long as we can reflect about it, we also notice that it is rich in significance and meaning. So this practice corresponds to the creation of a common designative name, but it's special because we also add to it a specific function, which is to identify places. That's what makes toponyms special. And even in terms of helping us think, I like to express the elements that are part of a toponym in a graphical way. So we have a toponymic triad, and it has to do with a place. This place, methodologically speaking, we can think of it as something that does not change. It's a place that is unchanging. This place will characterize and will be referenced by the other features of the toponym. Of course, that I'm speaking methodologically. This place, let's say that I'm saying it does not change. It can be defined by its geographical center. It can also be defined by a feature that is important. It can be built or not. And it can also be the geodesical center. We know that this changes, but in principle, we take it methodologically as a characteristic and that does not change. But all of the other elements of the triad that I mentioned, they do change with time. So this line here where I have T1, T2, T3, Tx, they mean the changes that are marked by dates. So I have a name that will designate this place. And in the time one, it can be one, but then it changes. And the same thing is what I'm calling geographical accidents. I'm using this term, this expression, geographical accidents, not because I am not aware of the fact that long ago, since the introduction of the theory systems of geography, we used to call geographical elements, or more recently, the importance of cartographic research or cartography as a geographical study, and it's been very important, but it's become even more important. And also the Anglo-Saxon literature, we've been using a lot the term feições in Portuguese, features. Excuse me, Professor Marcia, I'm sorry, but your presentation, the slides are not showing, so. Oh, I will. I would just like to explore this one. Let me try. I am moving the slides, but for us in the room, we're not seeing your slides. So I asked Ms. Trossand to stop showing her presentation and she will share it again. Maybe it's a mistake when she was sharing it. She needs to put that in presentation mode.
Fazendo, ele está em modo, vou pegar de novo. Ele aparece aqui, olha. Então, eu estou... bom, agora vamos ver. Para mim, ele aparece...
Já estou vendo. It is showing. I'm looking at your PowerPoint. Now, please put it in presentation mode. Can you see it?
PowerPoint toda, sem estar em modo de apresentação.
You need to put that in presentation mode.
Deixa eu ver aqui. O que eu posso fazer?
Márcia, no canto superior esquerdo, tem ali o do começo. Clica ali do começo, lá em cima.
He's just explaining to her how to put that in presentation mode.
Superior esquerdo.
No meu não aparece isso.
Não? Aqui
Não.
está aparecendo para a gente. Em cima de onde tem o slide menorzinho. Número 3.
Se apertar o F5, já apresenta direto.
Pode ser, verdade.
F5?
Isso.
Então, eu tenho que parar e voltar de novo, gente? É essa a orientação?
Não, pode apertar.
Pode
Apareceu aí? Apertou o F5, Márcia?
Pronto.
Não está aparecendo para a gente aqui, não. Deve ser a questão da janela.
A mesma coisa que aconteceu com a outra apresentação, não?
Aí quando eu aperto F5, quer dizer, eu consigo, eu vejo ele aberto na minha tela, eu passo os slides. Bom, então, só se eu pausar e mandar para vocês, pode ser assim?
Pode ser, Márcia. Pode ir falando, manda para a gente que a gente coloca aqui.
Então, tá. Talvez seja mais rápido mesmo, né?
Uhum.
Mando, então, para o seu WhatsApp, Manuel?
Pode ser, Márcia.
Pode? Tá. Então, um momento, desculpem.
I apologize for that. Just a moment.
Gente, enquanto resolve aí o problema técnico, eu vou aproveitar para dar alguns avisos. A
So I
programação
would like to say a few things. During this time, we will continue tomorrow. There will be a certificate for tomorrow for those who are watching. But no, we have a certificate for those who registered in the event. We have a certificate for the authorship of the works, people who submitted their work and were approved. They will have a certificate. There's also a certificate from presenting the works, people who had their work approved and were able to present during the event will have a certificate. And the other certificates are certificates for the lecturers and of the organizing committee of the event. And I'd also like to remind you that those of you who are watching on YouTube and also the platform of the event and also here at the Zoom, you can ask questions, and the questions also liven up the discussion afterwards. So feel free to ask questions whenever you want so that we can discuss the lectures afterwards. I would like to wish you all a great event, the continuation of the event, and we are here for whatever you need. The entire organizing committee is here, very much devoted to satisfying and pleasing everyone from the event. The communication channels are those that you know, and you can contact us if you have any problems. Now we will continue with Professor Massa. Thank you.
Eu que agradeço a ajuda e gostaria de pedir para você colocar o slide.
Thank you for your help. So could you please put that on the slide number 3? I was talking about a graphical representation of the toponymic triad, and it draws the attention to the fact that if we use the expression geographical accident, it's because there's a very important reason for that, considering the studies of acronyms that can be done thinking about the toponymic research. So accident also has different meanings because there are morphological features of the terrain, but philosophically, it can be understood as a quality that is not permanent from the individual, and the individual is the place, actually the subject is the place. So these qualities that are not permanent, they change, they correspond to a characteristic that is very important from the geographical space, which is the change. Even if it's in a human scale, even if in a human scale, we're not aware of this change, but we have registers about it. So in this slide, I'd like to call your attention to the elements that are involved and say that in this act of naming things, many times we see that it is a characteristic of the place that sensibilized that community, that touched that person who created the name. And then we go to the 4th slide to draw your attention to the fact that this environmental feature that motivated things, it becomes nominative, and this factor, this naming factor, and it can be built in terms of the geographical space. And so what we're calling the attention here is to the fact that the denominator, the person, the community, the one who's going to name, that person borrows a term from the geography, a term that we have in the geographical terminology, the terminology that we created. So these terms, they are very common. If I think about all of the names that TIC already mentioned in the seminal studies that it held about the Brazilian toponymy, so it drew the attention to the fact that they are many times used if we think about locations like the cities, the villages, communities, farms. So several types of places. You go to terms that are borrowed, and they are used, and so often that they are used in Portuguese, that also happens. that they are categorized and they are categorized as basic toponymic vocabulary or words. So this is the importance of the terms that are chosen to name places, and they're borrowed from geography like water, hill, sierra, port, village, city. So we have a lot of examples. And so the next slide here shows us these terms that we borrow from the geography. And these terms can have a simple specific element, like in this example, campaign or lavras ou veredinha, these terms in Portuguese, or a composite specific element. When it is a composite, when it has more than one term, the chosen name that is connected to an environmental feature still presents a characteristic. So the bar is a long bar, for example, the long water, and you have a beautiful field, all of those names in Portuguese, new mines, Minas Novas, Ponte Nova, new bridge, so Porto Firme, which is firm port. Many times when these terms are chosen and when they have to do with geographical accidents like farms or a small farm that many times represents its important reference in paths, many times people choose this toponym just for specific elements. It's Lajinha, it's the one that they know. It's a little stream that they know, Riachinho in Portuguese. They don't need to present anything else. But with the growth, and depending on the geographical accident, it's important that many times it's something that also impresses, because this margin is big, for example, and it draws our attention because of that. The next slide also shows another aspect that has to do with the importance of these terms that are borrowed, and they have to do with a linguistic matter, which is the semantical enrichment of the terms. So if I think about the compartments from the terrain in Brazil, we can see that these terrains, for example, this term chapada in Portuguese, that means a plateau or a slab, is not just a compartment, is not just a part of the relief, for example, a part of the terrain. We have a few more examples. In Minas Gerais state in Brazil, I'm not bringing all of the examples that could be mentioned considering the chosen name Chapada in Portuguese, which is loosely translated as a plateau, because the Chapada, in addition to part of the terrain, also has a correspondence in the Minas Gerais state that became a capitany, and also in the 1700s, it became important. So now this place is called Chapada do Norte, North Chapada, or is Chapada, Santa Cruz da Chapada, and it's a municipality in Minas Gerais state. But we will also find São João da Chapada, Chapada de Minas as districts, and many others in Minas Gerais state. So Chapada will not correspond just to a compartment in the terrain, in the geography. But geographically speaking, I tried to put here aspects that I believe are important and that have to do with this geographical dimension, not linguistic, but geographic. Remembering that this is data that has a lot of aspects that can be analyzed. So these geographical loans, they are important because normally these toponyms are not impersonal or artificial. They can be the expression of value, of appreciation, or admiration by an element of that location. They can also be written in the memory of a community, and they can correspond to a component of the identity. And they can also constitute a connection, a sentimental connection between the denominators of those places. They feed what we call topophilia, which also works, which has also worked, and that was mentioned by Professor Jordan. It's something that feeds, that makes this feeling possible, topophilia. And the importance of this feeling, we have studies showing this for a while now. The importance of the sense of belonging, of respect and care in relation to the environment that was built by men or transformed by men. So it is an important variable in the relationship of a person with its environment. And well, to deal with these geographical loans and considering the fact that the names, which would be that toponymic triad. So what happens? I'm going to deal with a few examples to something that I believe it's very important for us to know these geographical names and to put in our agendas, in our research agendas, the exploration of the names of these geographical loans in the same place. So we will begin with the Morro da Garça, Garça Hill in the loose translation. So in the travels that we know about the Portuguese America, especially Minas Gerais, Antonio, when he writes about the travels and the riches of Minas Gerais, he already mentions a region called Garças. It was still, it was not a village, but it was an important region on the path that had already been established between Sabará, one of the main villages of the gold mining in the Minas Gerais state that was established in the beginning. It's in the core of the exploration of gold in the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil in the beginning of the 18th century. So this path between Sabará and other populations of the mines and the cattle farms that were established along the São Francisco. And this path also led to the Bahia state. And in many maps, this is from 1767, which is one of the maps, of the oldest maps that we have of the Capitania that represents the entire Capitania. We already see a reference of a farm that's called Morro da Garça Farm. So it's a name that is very old. This community, I mean, in the lands of this basin, we had this place that developed, but it was just in 1960 that this village, which was a district of a big city in Minas Gerais, became a municipal headquarters. And nowadays they are found with the Geodesical Center of Minas Gerais. But this Morro da Garça also became a very special place because João Guimarães Rosa, our famous Brazilian writer, in Recado do Morro, he writes of a short story that was published in 1956 that is there. He talks about a short story that happens in this place, and it's a very important short story. It's very famous here. So the name, the old name, together with the story that was created by our famous writer, all of that brought a very special feeling of the population in relation to the name, in relation to the place. So it's a place now that is part of tourism, and it's a place that is very well taken care of by the population. So the Morro da Garça was lucky enough not to have its name changed. Its original name did not change. It's a name that is valued by the people who live there. But what happens then with this other place? Well, Belmiro Braga is not a geographical name, but already had a geographical name. Belmiro Braga is located between the small percentage of municipalities from Minas Gerais that did not change their name since the creation. It was created in 1960. But imagine that until the end of the 1990s, when other municipalities were created, the municipalities in Minas Gerais state, only approximately 14% of the municipalities kept their original name. And what I mean by that is the name that was chosen when that population started to live in that place, started to settle in those places. So Belmiro Braga was part of this happy statistics. It did not change its name, but actually it hides changes that are very significant. Belmiro Braga is a town in the border of Minas Gerais state, in the border of the state with the Rio de Janeiro state. It was created in 1960, and it has 3 districts. One of them, it's in the margin of Paraíba do Sul River. Belmiro Braga, Três Ilhos, and Porto das Flores. This is another very old name. But what does this current name hide? Let's see it then. Well, not only does it hide, but it's one of the examples that make me say, because we need, and this is an invitation to all of you, we need to go deeper on the research about our geographical names. But there is a fading out of those names. They're being forgotten, especially when that entity, that place, has hierarchies of populations and it becomes different. It becomes headquarters of district and of municipality. So it hides this forgetting that seems to have intensified in the previous century. So Belmiro Braga became a district even before the current city of Juiz de Fora was called Santo Antônio do Paraibuna. It became a district in 1850 to 1943 with this name of Vargem Grande, celebrating and describing a very characteristic feature of the toponymy of the Paraíba River, in particular its left margin, these big banks. Until 1943, it remained with this descriptive name, talking about these meadows, these floodplains, especially with this image that you can see on the left. We can see the size of its place, of this geographical feature, which is this meadow. But then it became Ibitiguaia in 1943. That was a time between 1920 something until 1943 with the creation of the names in Minas Gerais. That was a time in which many of these places gained indigenous names. But even though in the area, let's say, the names do not correspond to the languages spoken by an ethical groups. They did not describe many times the names. They were not proper for the geographical names that they wanted to celebrate. So Vargem Grande lost its name in 43, and until 1960, it was named as Ibitiguaia. But then,
Professora, só para avisar que faltam 5 minutinhos.
just to tell you that you have 5 minutes, Professor. All right, thank you. Thank you for letting me know that. So unfortunately, you can't see it properly, but this was to show that it was a peaceful city, very plain. So it was a big meadow. And in 1960, it became independent. And when it did that, it gained the name Emílio Braga. And at the time, they said that it was not important change because it was an impersonal name. It was just to pay homage to a writer, poet who was born in the town, but who lived for a long time as an adult, and even when he was elderly in Juiz de Fora, but it was his hometown. So the chosen name was Miro Braga. And in the square of the city, we can find this beautiful place here, which was a gift that the town received with this bandstand when it was a municipality of Juiz de Fora. But there's no signpost, there's nothing mentioning the poet and the writer. We find that in Juiz de Fora, but not in this place. But the city keeps, and the other slide is going to show that. That the city still has, and I only bring you one example, the name Vargem Grande is still in the football club, in the small stadium of the town, and in several other places. We can still find the name. So it is there, it is kept, naming places in the town. So this is just one example that I brought to you. But it also keeps and also became that as a municipality, this chapel that was built thanks to the mother of the writer. So this is an example to say that it was justified saying that it was not impersonal, but a few evidences show that the population is still very much connected to the first name of the village. And a last example that I'd like to bring you, this is also very interesting. And it justifies the interest, the fact that I'm presenting this call so that we can study the research about the geographical names. This is another municipality from Minas Gerais called Cachoeira do Pajeú, which received its name in 1989. This hydrotoponym was created to name a population in the district of the municipality of Salinas. And when there was a reformulation of the territorial configuration of the municipalities of the region, it became one sole district, but already belonging to the municipality of Pedra Azul, and it had the name of André Fernandes. And lastly, it remained with this name of Sede Municipal in 1962 when it had this other category of municipality. But what's interesting about this name is that afterwards the population chose in 1989 to change the name of the town, and it went back to its original name. So then I'm going to show you another slide, which is my last, I promise, with a beautiful waterfall that's that's called Cajueira do Pajeú. So you can imagine, after so many years, the community insisted to change the name. It won that and it celebrated the name. And so we can imagine that it represents a feature from the environment that is particularly valued. And it's there. There is a waterfall. It also has in a homonymal community in a region that is closed in the municipality of Monte Azul. So it's not in this Cajueira do Pajeú place, which does not have either a cachoeira, which is a waterfall in Portuguese, or even in the descriptions from the IBGE, they don't even talk about the Pajeú, which is a tree, a medium-sized tree. It's very beautiful. It's typical of the Caatinga biome, but it also shows in other biomes, and it has a flowering that is very attractive. So for the next few slides, just to close, showing the location, I used this division on purpose, microregion, because it talks about the location a lot more than otherwise. So we have Monte Azul in Minas Gerais state, which would be the northern region as a meso-region or intermediate region of Montes Claros currently. And we have Cajueira do Pajeú in Minas Gerais and the Vale do Jequitinhonha, which today is the intermediate region of Teófilo Otoni. So it's a toponym of saudade, of longing, and it's not an environmental feature of the municipality that brought about this name. But certainly we need to know the importance and why the population gives so much importance to a certain name. So that was to invite the researchers to study more this history of these geographical names. And lastly, I leave you with my last slide and my contact information. And I'm open for questions and contact if you're interested. Thank you.
Bom, professora Márcia, a gente agradece a apresentação. E antes da gente passar, então...
Thank you, Professor Márcia. And before we go for our Q&A session, we pass the floor to Professor Jordan Seaman for his presentation. Thank you very much. Professor Jordan Seaman.
Good afternoon to everyone. Technically I could speak in Portuguese, but I won't. So my talk will be in English, and it will be about Brazil. So it will be a talk about the poetics and politics in the names of Brazilian municipalities. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for having me at this event, at the second SIPAT. I did some kind of word game with the abbreviation, and when you translate SIPAT into English, it could be something like Pan-American International Symposium on names in toponymy, and that would be something like paint. So I hope that with my talk I can give some more paint to our discussion on place name studies in Brazil and in the world in general. So let's see if we can move here. Yes, there we go. So my talk, of course, will be a partial talk in the sense that I use a specific viewpoint. I'm a cultural historical geographer, teaching cartography, and evidently this point of view is different from a historian's point of view or a linguist's point of view. But at any rate, what I want to do is to engage people with place names from different points of view. So it can be cultural, political, geographical, economic, or it can be all these factors together. So my main point is, and I think that attracts me to place names, is that the names are not just there. Somebody, something is behind this. And for those of you who attended the opening ceremony this morning, when Jerry O'Reilly and Peter Jordan presented their reflections on place name studies, I think you can get a good overview about the diversity of place name studies. So especially when you listen to Jerry O'Reilly's talk, when he presented 30 or 40 different book chapters, it's really amazing how diverse the place name study landscape can be. So there are so many different approaches and projects, and probably this is only, let's say, 10% of the possibilities of what is possible in place name studies. So when I think about place names, I kind of compare this to detective stories. So in English, this is commonly known as a whodunit, or in Portuguese, quem matou, who did it. So it's this kind of story that you start a book, a little bit like the Da Vinci Code, and you cannot put down the book because, well, you want to know, you want to investigate further. And I just put the book covers of Joe Soares' book on Sherlock Holmes in Rio de Janeiro to illustrate this. So it's something that has got to do with our own curiosity. Place names are not facts, but they are social constructions. And our aim is to look further into this. You can also do the following and invert this process. So instead of asking who killed the person, you start with the scene of the crime, and then you wind back in your investigation. And probably you may have heard about this guy on the right-hand side of the slide, which it is Inspector Colombo, who was very famous in the 1970s with a series about crime investigation. And all the episodes started with the crime, and he was kind of reconstructing the crime. So sometimes I feel when I think about place names that this goes a little bit in this direction, that it's not the crime, but it's the place name that is there. And we try to trace this back to the sources and the motivations and why people used exactly a specific name for a specific place. So what I'm telling you here is nothing new. Maybe more than a decade, geographers have been engaging with what they call critical toponymies. So when you read the definition here, I think everything will become clearer for you. So how do cultural and political actors seek to control, negotiate, and manipulate the naming process, both in contemporary and colonial contexts? So the book that you can see here on the slide was organized by the Canadian geographer Lawrence Burke and the Finnish geographer Jani Vuotinaho in 2017. And basically, the book is a collection mostly of published papers. So there's a chapter on Hawaiian place names and how these are linked to Hawaiian identity or sense of place. There are chapters about the naming of places after Martin Luther King, mainly streets and avenues. And there are also newer chapters, there's including one chapter on internet domains that are labeled with geographical references. So when I present this definition to you, it is about, well, social actors or human actors. What are the humans behind names? The names are not out there in a namescape or in a landscape, but the names are produced by someone. And when you look into this, you will find out that there are so many different processes going on. And this kind of refers to the title of my presentation. So on this slide, this is a reference to a bibliographic paper that was published more than 10 years ago about new directions in toponymic research and critical place name studies. And the three authors, all of them have published quite a lot about place names. And they propose three different overlapping thematic clusters. And of course, this is an open list, which means you can come up with different ideas. And of course, as I said, these are overlaps, which means that you cannot see these topics separately. So when you look at the three clusters, you will see, well, one theme is about text landscapes. So this would be something that a linguist is more interested in when it comes to semiotic associations between place naming and political power. The second cluster would be the politics of naming, and this would refer to official naming practices, organizing principles imposed by authorities such as governments, for example, histories of spatial identification. And as a counterbalance to this, poetics of naming would refer to an initiative that grows with the population. So people who live in a specific place have got a specific label for this place. And as a result of this, it's not necessarily the opposite of politics, but it's a different scale and it's a different process, because this gets closer to a regional or a local identity. So as I mentioned, there's some kind of unbalanced relationship between creative ways of wording based on human values and identity, and the knowledge that is produced by discourse and power. But as I said, there's no contradiction or no idea of opposites when it comes to politics and poetics. They can play together very easily. So politics in this sense would be practices that aim to regulate and or control the creation of toponyms, and in which power relations have a special impact. So an example would be that a state government or a regional government just decides to name the streets in a neighborhood in a specific way. So they say all the streets will have the name Flowers, and that's it. But the local population wants animals. So how does this work? So this would be some kind of official naming practice that does not have a popular participation. Poetics, on the other side, would be something that really grows out of the ideas of people, that takes into account humanistic dimensions, and that also includes local narratives, subjective values, even some kind of folklore and urban legends. In order to put myself in the context of place name studies, I have been studying place names for about 20 years. So almost 20 years ago, I studied place names of the municipalities in the state of Sierra, and Marcia kind of hinted a little bit at this problem of indigenous place names and where they come from in Brazil. So I will talk about this a little bit later, giving you some further insights on this. And more recently, because if you publish something, it can take 1 to 3 years. So it's not something that you write in 2021 when you publish this in 2018. So more recently, I did a study that was more generally about place names in Brazil. So I did an analysis of the names of municipalities in Brazil and why they are named the way they are. In addition to this, and I said, well, it would be nice to be in Rio de Janeiro, but it's not possible right now. So that's the reason why I'm presenting a keynote talk and also a regular presentation on Friday. And on Friday, I will look into place names in the state of Indiana in the United States, in order to discuss not the changes of place names, but why place names do not change at all. So it's about the immutability, why there are these place names that stand like a rock in the sea and they do not change. And this is something that is getting more political and more relevant today, especially when you think about the case in the United States and schools, streets named after Confederate generals or people that openly expressed a racist or pro-slavery attitude in life. So there's also a trend in this sense. It's not only about place names, but it's also about monuments, for example. So it's a broader context of all this. So let's have a look at the municipalities in Brazil. And what I like to do is to create a word cloud. So you go just look at one of those apps. You can find this also on many internet pages where the maintainer of these pages want to know how many people write comments and what they write and what the topics are. So when you just throw this into one pot and you mix it around, you will come up with something similar to this when you pick the 5,500 and something municipalities in Brazil. So for this study, I decided to limit myself to the municipality names. So if I added the names of districts or smaller settlements or even of the hydrography, the picture would be far more complex and complicated. But at any rate, when you look at this word cloud, what can we see? What are the most frequent words? Looking at this, well, what jumps into your face are, let's say, more generic names. You have cardinal directions. So you see Sul and Norte and West. So you have the four, well, I don't know, the East must be somewhere, probably it's less common, but you have references to the geographical location. And this is something that you frequently find in municipality names. So if you have two places with the same name or with the same saint as a name, you have to put some kind of geographical addition to say, well, it's from the north, or it's from the south, or it's from the east, or whatever place. Another factor or another feature that strikes us here is that you have a lot of religious names. So when you look at this, you see Santo and Santa that are very common. And I think the only failure of this word cloud is that it kind of kicked out the word Sal, which would be similar to Santo. So probably the algorithm just decided not to include this here. Probably it would be more frequent than Santo or Santa. So probably, as you can imagine, well, this is in connection with the name of a saint. So you find geographical aspects. So you have rivers, fields, Rio, Campo, Serra, and so on. You also find some qualities like bon and alegre. So you have some kind of, I remember there was a place in the state of Paraná, which was called the meager field, the poor field, Campo Magro. And people started an initiative because they thought this is not a good name for tourism. So there are a lot of stories when you're looking into this. And you can also, looming somewhere in the middle, you have Maria there, you have Paulista, and you have names of presidents. So it's interesting to look at the list of presidents. And I come back to this. When you think about presidents, you think about a lot of dead guys, but President Sarney has his name eternalized in a municipality in the state of Maranhão. So if you take your time, you will find far more different factors in this word cloud. So what I did is nothing new. So I'm not the person to invent the wheel when it comes to place name studies. So this may be traced back to a more systematic study in the 1970s by Sergio de Oliveira, who was a cartographer, he wrote the Dictionary of Cartography, which was pretty popular in Brazil at the time when it came out. So he did something similar to what I did, but he did not only pick the names, but he picked the names that he found on the international map at a scale of 1 to 1 million, and he just started creating categories. So he was creating categories that referred to hydrography, to persons. And when you look at this, you will find many different classification schemes. How can you classify place names? So what I find very intriguing, or at least, or funny, if I want to be frank, is Oliveira's conclusion. So he finishes his article on the psychosocial origins of place names in Brazil, saying that according to the Brazilian toponymy, our people are essentially Catholic, bucolic, optimistic, and nationalist. So in the context of the year 2021, I can imagine that many people will definitely disagree coming to a conclusion like this. So what I want to do on the following slides, probably my talk maybe a little bit shorter, so we will have more time for discussion, is to look a little bit into this game between politics and poetics of naming in Brazil. So evidently, when you think about the politics of naming places, think about laws and decrees, and especially during the Vargas regime in the late 1930s, and especially after 1943, when Brazil had to take a side in the Second World War, there was much going on as far as place name regulations were concerned in Brazil. So, for example, when you pick this decree ley from October 1943, there's an article that gives us some rules for naming. So the decree says, well, no duplicate names should be allowed. So it means there can only be one Rio de Janeiro, not 2 or 3. You can, of course, think about Rio de Janeiro do Sul or do Norte, but there can only be one with this name. At the same time, the recommendation is to avoid dates, commemorative dates, or foreign terms, or the names of living people, or place names with more than 2 words in its label. And in addition to this, and I come back to this on one of the next slides, there's a recommendation to use indigenous names and names with local references. So when you analyze the current place names, you will see a lot of violations in this sense that are not corresponding to this rule. But it would be unfair to say, well, that does not work, that you have a legislation and in practice it does not work, because this is not the case. Some of these place names evidently existed before the decree law in 1943. But it's really curious when you look at the most prominent municipality name in Brazil. So Bom Jesus figures at least in the name of 20 different municipalities in Brazil. So 5 of them are just Bom Jesus, and then you see you have some kind of regional, local, or some kind of specific reference in the south, in the north, the Araguaia River, in the state of Goiás, and so on. But curiously, and I really find it striking, there are 2 municipalities with the name Bom Jesus Tocantins. But it happens that one of them is a fake one because it's not in Tocantins, but it's in the state of Pará, but probably at the shores of the Tocantins River. So there's a lot going on, and what I find fascinating is to see the variety of names and the creativity. So, for example, what I mentioned about the rules, Vila Bela da Santíssima Trindade, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words. Recommendation is about 2 words. Then you look at 13 de Mayo in Santa Catarina, so commemorative date. And as I mentioned, you have a municipality called Presidente Sarney. Blumenau technically is a German name because it's named after a person from Germany, Dr. Hermann Blumenau. And then there's a really curious case of Panambi in the southern state of Rio Grande do Sul. So originally, this place was a German colony called Neu-Württemberg. And during its life, it changed to Elsenau because it was a tribute to the mayor's wife, Else. And after that, it turned into Pindorama in 1938. Then Tabapirin in 1944, which means the village of the red roofs. And then it gained its current name, which is Panambi Valley of the Butterflies. So once again, is this question, well, there are a lot of name changes. So who is behind this? And I will give you some more details about what is going on. So when you look at these different names, you will see that there are a lot of curiosities. And I will just mention a few. Once I did a field trip to the Tocantins River from Sierra, so I passed a place called Nova Yorkie. So I was really curious because people were joking about this. Well, we don't have to travel to the United States because Nova Yorkie is here. So this is a reference to a local American merchant who gave this place the name. Or you think about Barcelona, you think about Spain, but then you find out that the local powerful family had a rubber plantation in the Amazon that was called Barcelona. So they labeled the municipality with the same name. Auperkater, sandals, refers to a person who was a popular personality in this town of Minas Gerais. And then you have curiosities like Tio Hugo, Uncle Hugo, who was the local owner of the gas station. He was very, very much liked by the population. And finally, and this is the one that's more or less in the center, the municipality of Plaques or Placas, which is simply by the fact that there were a lot of outdoors and road signs on the Trans-Amazonian highway, and that's why the name stuck with the people, and they decided to name the town Placas. So my personal favorite is a place called Venhaver in the state of Rio Grande do Norte in northeastern Brazil. I had the pleasure to visit this place about 20 years ago when I was teaching some classes there. And Venhaver means, well, come and see. So I kind of got into this trap because I was curious about the name. So when you go to this place, we'll see there's some kind of central avenue that you can find on Google Street View that kind of uses a stone relief to tell the history of the town. So where does the name come from? And I will be really brutal. I will not tell you the story because I would like to encourage you to find this out about this. Find out about this by yourself. So evidently, when you find out where the name comes from, you will see that there are a lot of different folkloric tales and a lot of different stories that it's almost impossible to really say where the name came exactly from this source. So coming back to the indigenous place names in Brazil, Teodoro Sampaio is a really big reference in the
Licença,
history.
só para avisar que faltam 5 minutinhos, tá
I'm
bem?
sorry, this is just to tell you that you have 5 minutes. All right, sure.
The example of Teodoro Sampaio, who was an African Brazilian engineer, historian, politician, historian, and so on. And he wrote a book about the Tupi language in the National Geography of Brazil. So he wrote that there is no one who does not know of the predominance of Tupi in our geographical denominations. Our mountains, rivers, cities, and simple settlements generally carry barbarian names that the Gentiles, previously the dominators of these lands, applied to them, in which the conquerors respected, in which today are preferred by everyone, because not rarely Portuguese names of old localities are changed and replaced with others of indigenous provenance. It's a very interesting observation, but it is slightly naive when you look into his argument, because what happened was that there was no, let's say, compatibility between the indigenous languages and the Portuguese languages. It seems Portuguese tended to misunderstand indigenous pronunciations. So the result of this was that the names were totally changed from its indigenous origins. But what I want to tell you is that many of these names are in fact inventions from the Vargas times in the late 1930s and the early 1940s. So I call this a Tupinization of place names. And this is a study that I did some 19 years ago about the place name changes in the state of Ceará. So Thomas Pompeu Sobrinho, who was an engineer and writer, applied this to the state of Ceará. And he said, the idea of modifying the toponymic picture without doubt brings, in addition to a practical result, a certain dose of healthy Brazilianness, because it contributes to increase the spirit of national cohesion, reminding the most parochial Brazilians of each province that its state is not alone in the Brazilian Union, that others exist with their political rights, equally worthy of all respects. Evidently, this was a nationalistic project in order to show the integralism of Brazil and a national spirit that was considered more important than regional attitudes in the country. So since I'm running out of time, I would like to go to my conclusions. So first of all, for place name studies, at least from a point of view of culture geography, it would be necessary, it is necessary to think about poetics and politics of place names at the same time. What is the importance of political, economic, and social cultural context in the naming process? And as I said, sometimes this can be some kind of detective work, or sometimes you will never find out where the name exactly came from. So place names can be signifiers of political power and governmental interference, but they can also evoke stories and forge identities. And these identities can be true or false, or they can simply be an urban legend. So my proposal here for discussion is that research should go beyond what is semantic and romantic and dig deeper into names. So what is in a name? Evidently, there's far more in a name than just words. So thank you very much for your attention.
Bom, eu que agradeço a apresentação, professor Seaman, foi excelente. Uma coisa que me chamou a atenção em ambas as
Thank you, Professor Seaman, for your presentation. And what drew my attention in both lectures is the concern that we have, especially in terms of the place naming motivation, which is one of the hardest things, because we actually have to find out. And sometimes we need to investigate the motivation of this name, because sometimes we see that in a few things and we see that superficially, and we end up reproducing a mistake and not going deeper in what it actually is. So that's also very important. So both lectures were important. Thank you very much. So now we will pass, we will have our Q&A. So the first question is Professor Márcia. Menezes is asking if the transformation of a great deal of the railway stations and they became villages and towns, both in Rio de Janeiro and in Minas Gerais, if they could be considered as a toponymic loan. Thank you for the question. Thank you for your appreciation and for your thanks in terms of my work. So let's see. I think that many of those stations actually became villages and towns in Minas Gerais and in Rio. Many of them, many, many, many. But generally, they took the name of, they ended up having the name of an engineer who was important in building, that path, that that section of the road. So in general, they're not classified. I mean, those names are not classified as geographical loans. If those villages, and here I think I remember because I was really paying attention to Professor Siemens' lecture, and so I have to think now. So names, if there was a Estação Grande, a great station, and if it were a railway station, a railroad station, or if it just had station on the name in Portuguese, estação, but if there were this word, we could say that it was a loan, really, because it is an element of the space that was built by men, a space that was transformed by men. But so long as you don't have the name with the registration or the presentation of a specific name or a composite name, so long as you don't have the word station or railroad station, then it could not be considered a loan. But I don't remember an example right now. All of the examples that come to my mind have to do with names of engineers or because there was the name station because of the place, or it gained another name. Sometimes maybe because of another word, it can be classified in many ways, but it does not correspond to a toponym. But I will look into it to see if I can find this example.
Uma outra, perdão, e uma outra colocação que fizeram aqui também.
Another comment that was made here is if you could talk about the toponym of saudade, which is a Portuguese term that refers to longing, loosely translated. So saudade has to do with a taxi created by Maria Vicente Nadic when she studied the Brazilian toponymy. So this saudade toponym, it applies to the names that refer to another location. For example, there's a very controversial name in Minas Gerais state, in the south of the state in Brazil, that's called Cabo Verde. Cabo Verde, Cape Verde, loosely translated, that could be classified as toponym based on saudade. There are many explanations about that. It's related with what you mentioned, the difficulty of finding the actual motivation for the name itself, but it refers to a location in Africa. And to add more to the fire, 2 years ago, I was talking to a Portuguese professor who was a geographer, who was very well known in Brazil. And he talked in a symposium that Paulo and Manuel were there. And he said that Cape Verde was actually a reminiscence of a map from the Renaissance, from the end of the Renaissance and the start of the modern age, when we started to depict the African shores. And so the Cape Verde, as we know it now, the Cape was made green, colored as green. But there was no reference to any type of rock, anything to remind ourselves of a feature, but I think I went too far. But close to Belo Horizonte, it's even part of this municipality, there's a district called Benda Nova, and close to its district, we have a municipality called Matozinhos. Those are names of Portuguese places which were brought here to Brazil. So maybe, I'm not saying that for sure, that the name was chosen because of that, but maybe that can be related to the saudade, to this longing, this remembering of a place which is dear to someone. I believe that there's a comment from Cândida, Maria Cândida there on the chat. She added a bit to what I said. I think it's important for you to read on the chat. But this place name of the city, it refers to something that is generally an element of the geographical space that was either built or it isn't, but many times it is alone, a geographical alone, but it is related to experiences from that group or people who named the place. But for sure, in the works of Ajik from 1990 and many others who worked on this, you can find very rich references to this place naming. It is common. It's present in many regions of Brazil and of other places as well. Today, if I'm not mistaken, and again, I'm going to mention Professor Jordan, but he made a reference to a toponym of the city when he was talking about a toponym in Canada. So that's something that reminds people of another place. So that's why I mentioned Cachoeira do Pajuru, knowing that we have Sertão do Pajeú in Pernambuco state. And maybe that would also be reminiscence of that memory of that region, or another from Minas Gerais. I don't know if I answered your question, but I'm here. Yes, thank you. Yes, of course you did. But now I'm going to ask Professor Seaman. We have a question here by Elis Larisse saying that in this sense, good evening, in the sense having in view this decree of nationalization from the Vargas regime, it's hard to conclude that the indigenous toponyms are traces of identity and memory of these people, of indigenous people. Is there a methodology, hang on, I just have to finish reading. Is there a methodology to differentiate what is motivated and what is an arbitrary decision in toponymy? All right, I'm going to answer in English.
Source that can be used to know about the name, if it's a fake or a real indigenous name, is to look into official documents. So the example that I gave you about the state of Ceará is published in the so-called Diário Oficial do Estado. So any kind of name change is not something that is discussed at the table of a bar or somewhere outside, or it is something that has to be officially recognized. So as a result of this, for the present, you easily can find all these laws and decrees online, especially when it comes to state legislation and federal laws. So in the case of what I presented here, it's just, well, you have to check, so what kind of law is about place names, and then you can look this up. The only problem with this is that you see that the names have changed to indigenous names, but that's pretty much all that you can get out of this. So there's no information about who did this. Was it the president himself? Was it a governor? Was it an administrative employee? Was it a politician? And so on. So we do not get the context that we would like to know about, to see if there were different options. Because there are some cases that people came up with different options for naming different indigenous names. And of course, someone had to make a decision about which name to choose. So when you look at these official documents, you will easily see what are authentic indigenous names and what are names that go back to only 70 to 80 years in the history of Brazil. I would like to go one step further, saying that indigenous names today gain a different notion. So it has already been mentioned that place names are not only something of the past, but especially when it comes to renaming, they can confirm and strengthen cultural identities. So, for example, when an indigenous group decides to change the European place name of their settlement into an indigenous name, this is definitely a cultural statement, a political statement. It can be a statement of resistance. It can be a statement of empowerment. So place names that turn into indigenous names, not in the case of the Vargas regime, can also be a mechanism or to consolidate identities. And there are different examples, especially in Canada, where there's an initiative to create indigenous atlases. This is something that should be considered. In addition to this, you do not have to be indigenous to propose an indigenous name. So it can also be a process that people say, well, we would like to pay a tribute to indigenous people who do not live here anymore, but we want to keep the memory of the past of these people. And this can sometimes be a marketing strategy. So people are doing this because, as I mentioned, the name of Campo Magro in the state of Paraná, where when the name is ugly, you will not attract tourists and you will not attract investment. So it can go into different directions. And there have been recent studies about, well, place names and the power of marketing when you change the names.
Bom, então vamos passar para a nossa, então eu
Well,
acredito.
then I believe that we are going to our last question today. It's for Professor Márcia, asked by Professor Peter Jordan. So he thanks Márcia for her important lecture, and then he asks, isn't the omnimization a key term within the context of the first part of your presentation? Omnimization in the sense of generics developing into proper names over time.
Obrigada, professor. Bom, sim, são nomes genéricos, e o que nós chamamos, então, de empréstimos geográficos, né? Eu fiquei um pouco preocupada quando eu li o termo que foi usado, cheguei a consultar os...
I read the term that was used. I'm sorry, I was speaking the Portuguese channel. He had to ask Paulo to see if she understood the term, because at a first glance, I was thinking, Professor, and thank you for your question, but having in view the comments that I asked Paulo, maybe that would be the name that was not well seen as time went by. So those geographical names, many times they talk about a characteristic of the territory that sometimes is not very well seen. For example, dirty water, água suja in Portuguese, that would be an example that was exchanged. The population at the first moment opportunity changed the name. But I don't think it is in this sense that you meant, right? And also, talking to Paulo, we were thinking maybe this term can be understood as a way, a means to make something that's not friendly, something that is unfriendly, and make it more friendly. But I believe it's more than that. In the case of proper geographical names, what we're calling that, those are generics, and they have to do with the terminology of a science, geographic science, but they reflect the connection, the impact and the feeling that can be positive or negative, as in the case of, good water, água boa is a positive feeling, but dirty water isn't. And so that's an impact. It's a perception. It's something that the individual or the community, they were touched by that. But yes, here using the terminology that we use is all very much connected to the AGIC work. We call that geographic proper names. I don't know if I was able to answer your question, but as I said before, I'm open for clarifications if you want to. Well, since our time is almost up, we only have 5 minutes to close the room. I'd like to thank everyone, thank our guests. Thank you very much for your lectures. They were excellent. And I'd also like to thank everyone for your presence, those who watched the lecture from our symposium. And I'd like to remind you all that our activities will begin 9 a.m. with session number 2. And once again, I remind you that the videos of the sessions will be available on the Cartography Lab channel on YouTube. Okay, so once again, thank you very much for your presence. A good evening and see you all tomorrow. Thank you.